On February 1st, 2004, during the halftime show of Super Bowl 38, a moment lasting less than a second permanently altered the careers of two of the most famous pop stars in the world, Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. But to understand why the fallout unfolded the way it did, it is necessary to examine the cultural and professional climate that led them to that stage in the first place. In the early 2000s, the Super Bowl halftime show was undergoing a deliberate transformation. After years of legacy rock acts and marching band-style performances, the NFL and its broadcast partners sought to capture younger audiences, embracing pop, hip-hop, and spectacle-driven performances. MTV, which produced the 2004 halftime show, was at the height of its cultural influence, shaping music trends, celebrity images, and youth culture through platforms like Total Request Live and the Video Music Awards. The goal was not subtlety or restraint, but impact, controversy, and memorability, and that philosophy guided every creative decision behind the show. At that time, Janet Jackson was in the midst of a deliberate artistic evolution. Having spent decades carefully balancing mainstream appeal with personal expression, she had entered the 2000s leaning more openly into themes of sexuality, intimacy, and adult autonomy. Albums like All For You and promotional visuals surrounding them positioned her as confident, sensual, and self-directed, challenging the industry's long-standing tendency to police female pop stars' bodies once they crossed a certain age or level of independence. Jackson was not an up-and-coming artist seeking attention, but an established icon with nothing left to prove, which made her willingness to participate in a youth-oriented, high-energy halftime show both a statement of relevance and a risk. Her image had already been scrutinized for years, and she was well aware that any perceived misstep would be magnified far more intensely than it would be for many of her peers. Justin Timberlake, by contrast, was in a very different phase of his career. Having recently broken away from NSYNC, he was in the process of rebranding himself as a serious solo artist rather than a former boy band member. His debut solo album, Justified, had been a commercial and critical success, aided by collaborations with Pharrell Williams and Timbaland that positioned him at the intersection of pop and R&B credibility. Timberlake's public image at the time was carefully curated to balance sensitivity, charm, and edge, presenting him as a safe yet exciting figure for mainstream audiences. The Super Bowl halftime show represented a massive opportunity for him to solidify that transition on the biggest stage possible, reinforcing his status as a leading man in pop music rather than a nostalgic teen idol. The pairing of Jackson and Timberlake was not accidental. Their collaboration on Rock Your Body had already proven successful, and the song itself carried a flirtatious energy that fit MTV's vision for a provocative but controlled spectacle. Rehearsals for the halftime show were tightly choreographed, with strict timing requirements due to the live broadcast and the limited performance window. According to accounts from those involved, the ending move that became infamous was discussed as a dramatic flourish, intended to align with the song's lyrics and deliver a visually striking conclusion. The expectation, as later stated, was that a portion of Jackson's costume would be removed to reveal an underlayer, not bare skin. Whether this miscalculation stemmed from costume design, choreography execution, or miscommunication remains debated. But what is clear is that the show was designed to push boundaries while relying on the assumption that the broadcast would remain within acceptable limits. The broader media environment of the early 2000s also played a crucial role in shaping the reaction. This was a period marked by heightened sensitivity to perceived moral decline in popular culture, amplified by political pressure from conservative advocacy groups and increased scrutiny from regulators like the FCC. Reality television, celebrity scandals, and tabloid culture dominated headlines, creating an atmosphere where outrage functioned as both entertainment and moral signaling. The Super Bowl, as a family-oriented event watched by millions across age groups, became the symbolic battleground for these anxieties. When the incident occurred, it did not exist in a vacuum but collided directly with ongoing debates about decency, censorship, and the influence of pop culture on youth. In the immediate aftermath, the speed with which the narrative solidified was remarkable. The image of Jackson's exposed breast was replayed repeatedly, often stripped of context, while the performance as a whole was reduced to that single frame. Media coverage fixated on her body rather than the mechanics of the performance, reinforcing a long-standing tendency to frame women's physical exposure as a moral failure rather than a production error. Timberlake, meanwhile, was largely shielded by a narrative that emphasized surprise and detachment, positioning him as a participant who had unintentionally triggered an unforeseen outcome. This imbalance was not merely the result of public opinion, but was reinforced by institutional responses that treated Jackson as a liability and Timberlake as salvageable. As networks scrambled to appease advertisers and regulators, decisions were made that disproportionately affected Jackson's career. Her removal from upcoming televised events, the quiet suppression of her music, and the withdrawal of promotional support sent a clear message to the industry about who would bear the cost of controversy. Timberlake's continued access to platforms and opportunities demonstrated how quickly the system moved to protect an artist who fit comfortably within its preferred image of marketable masculinity. These outcomes were not officially framed as punishment, yet their cumulative effect was undeniable, altering the trajectory of Jackson's public presence during a critical period of her career. In the years since, the events leading up to the Super Bowl halftime show have been re-examined as part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated mistake. The performance was the product of an industry that actively encouraged provocation while refusing to share responsibility when provocation crossed an invisible line. Jackson's willingness to participate in that environment made her vulnerable to consequences that were always unevenly distributed, while Timberlake's role was reframed as incidental rather than integral. The legacy of that night lies not only in the moment itself, but in the chain of decisions, assumptions, and power structures that preceded it, shaping how the fallout unfolded and why it continues to resonate. What happened after the Super Bowl cannot be separated from what came before it. The performance was the culmination of strategic branding, cultural tension, and institutional appetite for spectacle. And when that spectacle backfired, the response exposed deep inequities in how accountability is assigned. Nearly 2 decades later, the conversation persists because it challenges the idea that consequences are neutral or inevitable, revealing instead how they are shaped by status, perception, and systemic bias. The story of Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake at the Super Bowl is ultimately less about a costume malfunction and more about an industry that profited from risk while punishing those least protected when that risk became inconvenient.